Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. We got a massive set of class changes in the pipeline with a brand new set of patch notes released for both PvE and PvP content, with this set of class changes set to take effect next week's reset, depending on your region. Tuesday for NA, Wednesday for EU, basically the day when you get your weekly vault reset. This set of changes features a bunch of updates, from massive buffs to many different healers out there to try to equalize the meta with some significant tuning for Holy Priest in particular, but also DPS specs like Beastmaster Hunter, adjustments for Elemental Shamans, but also so many different PvP adjustments, some more surgical and others more broad, like a fairly large nerf for healers within big group PvP content. There's a lot to go over, so I kind of want to dive into this video as soon as possible, but I'll have chapter marks down below in case you want to skip directly to the classes that are the most relevant to you. As always, if you guys want to see more regular class updates and patch notes coverage for Season 2 content in the War Within, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Before going over all the individual class and spec changes, we do have a global change happening for all healers within PvP content specifically. They are trying to reduce some of the healing aspects within PvP in content such as rated 2v2 arenas, where all matches will start with 10% additional healing reduction to try to shorten some of the matches that are with healer DPS comps, but also they're reducing some of the effectiveness of healers within solo as well as RBG content, reducing all healing by 10%, I believe, just to try to give players a better chances to land a kill and to progress games a little bit faster. So this is going to be one of those global changes that will affect every single healer within PvP content. From there, we move on to the class of Death Knight, where we're not seeing too many changes for dungeons and raids. The only spec that's receiving any major updates is Frost Death Knight, which is seeing all ability damage buffed by 4%, which is a solid gain, but it's not going to be anything game-changing, or is not going to cause you to change your builds in any specific way. Though from there, we do have majority PvP changes for Death Knights, with them trying to make them a little bit more durable against melee classes and physical damage. And the way they're going about it is through Bloodforged Armor PvP talent, making it last 4 seconds instead of 3 seconds, reducing physical damage taken by 25% instead of 20. Not necessarily what Death Knights would like to see, though I'm pretty sure a lot of Death Knights would like to see a little bit more passive survivability buffs, or maybe like a Death Strike improved, or rather not being gutted completely within PvP so it actually can do a solid bit of healing. But this should at least reinforce some on physical damage, even if slightly. They also buffed up the damage of Soul Reaper within PvP content, increasing its execute damage to targets below 35% health by 75% to maybe make it a little bit better, and you could have some synergy with the Deathbringer playstyle. Besides that, both Unholy and Blood Death Knight are seeing buffs towards the Syndaean playstyle, where both specs are going to see a 30% damage increase on the Vampiric Strike ability. From there, we got Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is arguably one of the more popular tanking specs for Mythic Plus dungeons, which are receiving a slight defensive nerf. But the talent of Deflecting Spikes is now going to increase the parry chance by additional 10% instead of 15%, slightly reducing their survivability within PvE content. This seems like such a minor change. I doubt that we'll see Vengeance Demon Hunters rotated out completely from their pretty dominant spot for Mythic Plus dungeons, but maybe it'll give some chances for other tanks to shine, and it looks like other tanks, for the most part, are receiving some buffs as well. From there, we have the class of Druid, starting with a spec of Balance, which is receiving for PvE content quite a decent bit of single target damage increases, from Wrath being increased by 30%, Star Surge increased by 5%, and when you play the Illune's Chosen playstyle together with Lunar Calling, the Lunar Calling's Starfire damage to primary target is being increased to 160% instead of 100%, which would hopefully result in a little bit better priority and single target damage. Though for PvP, Balanced Druids are seeing a bit of a restructuring, as a lot of them are stuck playing around Keeper of the Grove playstyle and are overly reliant on Keeper in order to deliver some decent PvP damage. So they're trying to change out the damage profile for Boomkins a little, but buffing the damage of both Sunfire and Moonfire by 33% within PvP. Defensively, Balanced Druids are also seeing a buff towards Frenzied Regen, which is no longer reduced by 38% within PvP content. However, when it comes to the Keeper of the Grove playstyle, specifically with the talent of Harmony of the Grove, that is being reduced slightly to increase the overall spell damage during the capstone by 4% instead of 8% per stack. which trades out some of the burstiness of Keeper for some more sustained damage profile. When it comes to the spec of the Guardian Druid, we're seeing more adjustments towards the Druid of the Claw playstyle, where talents such as the Dreadful Wound Bleed, that is being buffed up by 20%. Empowered Shapeshifting is going to increase the damage of Swipe by 12%, up from 6%, and Mangle's damage by 25% instead of 15%. But it looks like they are reducing the Wild Power Surge bonus rip damage down to only 200% instead of 225%. The rest of the changes are going to affect druids only from a PvP perspective, starting with the spec of Feral, where 2 PvP talents, one of them being Tireless Pursuit, are being nerfed, with Tireless Pursuit increasing movement speed by 25% instead of 40%, while Wicked Claws is now going to decrease healing received by 16% instead of 20%. And I'm assuming that is the number that you would see when you have 2 stacks of Infected Claws on a target. So instead of increasing it by 10% per stack, I believe that's going to make it about 8% per stack. Lastly, we have Restoration Druids, where they're also seeing a buff towards their Frenzied Regeneration to no longer be decreased by 50% within PvP, which should hopefully complement with quite a bit of additional personal healing. From there, we also have the class of the Evoker, where all 3 specs are also seeing a number of changes and tunings, primarily covering their tier set bonuses, at least for 2 of the 3 specs. For starters, with Devastation, they're actually reducing the effectiveness of their Nerebar Palace, because for many Devastation Evokers, it is very difficult to drop their original Nerebar 2-piece and even 4-piece bonuses in place of the brand new one from Undermine. So to help with that transition, they're actually nerfing the Nerebar Palace 4 set to reduce the cooldown of Eternity Surge and Shattering Star by 1 second instead of 4 seconds, which plays pretty heavily into their cooldown reduction mechanic and empowerment usage. But they're also buffing the 2 set and the 4 set bonuses. With the 2 set, you'll now cast a Shattering Star through the Jackpot mechanic at 100% effectiveness instead of 50% effectiveness, and the 2 set proc rate is now triggering at 25% more frequently, which means more Jackpot procs. The 4 set now will increase the spell empowerment damage by 25% per stack instead of by 20% per stack, greatly increasing that empowerment value, which should hopefully allow Devastation Evokers to wean off of their Nerebar set and be more likely to transition into Liberation of Undermine set a lot earlier, outside of just getting that higher item level bump. The spec of Augmentation is also going through a number of changes, though not specific changes, rather they're just increasing all spell damage and all ability damage by 15%. So this is everything that causes them to deal additional damage to enemies. That is being amped up. This does not buff up their Ebonite. This doesn't affect the abilities such as Prescience, or it shouldn't affect anything that buffs allies' effectiveness, just anything that is their personal source of damage, from their Azure Strikes to the damage of Eruption to the damage of Living Flame. All that is going up by 15%. Hard to tell if that'll be enough to rotate Augmentation back into the meta, or at least in a playable state, as the spec really fell off at the beginning of the season, with many players not really missing them. So we'll see exactly how that change adjusts their effectiveness going forward. Preservation also sees the Nerebar tier set nerfed a little bit as well. Well, the 4 set is now going to increase the healing of empowerment spells by 5% per stack instead of by 10% per stack, to try to make that new 4 set a little bit more appealing. However, they're also buffing them in a variety of ways, by increasing the healing of all of the spells by 5%, increasing the effectiveness of empowerment abilities such as Spirit of Bloom by 20%, which makes Chrono Warden a little bit more effective. Their passive of Energizing Flame now restores not 50% of its mana, but now it's going to be 80% of its mana when using Living Bomb against an enemy, to try to make it a little bit less mana taxing. The damage of Disintegrate is going to go up by 25% for Preservation only, and even the damage of Living Flame goes up by 15%, though only in PvE content, not affecting them in PvP whatsoever. From there, we have the class of the Hunter, and then notice that Beast Mastery, Marksmanship, and Survival haven't been performing exactly as well as they would like them to. So all 3 of those specs are receiving a variety of different damage buffs. So most of them are going to be through some of their hero talent options, however. For Beast Mastery, they're mostly going through by buffing the Dark Ranger playstyle and a little bit of the Pack Leader gameplay. With Dark Ranger, they're trying to make sure the Black Arrow's periodic duration is now increased to 14 seconds rather than 10 seconds. With the Dark Ranger Withering Fire Capstone, it'll now try to prioritize enemies that don't already have a Black Arrow to apply it, so you can spread that dot damage to multiple targets, and Withering Fire will now fire 4 additional Black Arrows instead of 2 for Beast Mastery. As for the leader of the pack, the lead from the front talent, they were able to fix a bug that prevented lead from increasing the pack leader's bore damage, which should hopefully result in a little bit better single target damage, but also in significant added cleave damage as well. For the spec of marksmanship, they're also receiving buffs, like a buff towards their explosive shot damage increased by 15%, as well as the damage to volley increased by 25%. The Dark Ranger version of marksmanship also receives significant buffs, with the damage of Black Arrow increased by 50%. The duration of Black Arrow periodic effect increased to 14 seconds, up from 10. Talents like Phantom Pain are now going to have better cleave damage, increased to 24% shared damage instead of 8%, which is a significant gain. The damage of Blake Powder for the AoE counterpart is now going to be increased by 100%, and Withering Fire is also going to try to prioritize targets that do not already have a Black Arrow periodic effect for better spread dot damage. Though marksmanship also receives some changes for PvP as well, and while the ability of Black Arrow is being buffed for PvE, for PvP it's actually receiving a 15% nerf. Also, they're reducing the effectiveness of marksmanship's force down to 25% within PvP, which was initially 50% as effective, but now it's even less effective than before. Then we have the spec of Survival, which is receiving a roughly 4% damage amp all across the board, as well as significant buffs towards the Pack Leader playstyle, where talents such as Dire Summon's kill command cooldown reduction is now being increased to 2 seconds rather than 1 second. Both the Boar and the Bear of the Pack Leader gameplay, both of their damage is being amplified by 40%, which is of a significant gain. The duration of Howl of the Pack Leader is now reduced to 25 seconds instead of 30 seconds for Survival, which means that you actually will be able to call upon your Wyvern, Boar, and Bear a little bit more often as this spec specifically. And they also fixed the bug with lead from the front that prevented Boar from getting significant damage buffs, which should hopefully result in better single target but also better cleave damage, as that was the Boar is really good for. From there, we got the class of Mage, and all 3 specs of Arcane, Frost, and Fire did see some buffs and nerfs, but nothing special, just really an aura buff for all of these specs. Like Arcane, which is one of my favorites, it got an 8% damage buff all across the board, which doesn't really change the playstyle, but it does make him slightly more effective. The spec of Frost saw a roughly 4% damage buff, which is basically like Arcane, just not as big of a gain. And the spec of Fire saw a 3% damage nerf overall. Not the biggest loss after seeing how well they did within the raids of Undermine, but it is a slight dampener on the overall output, I think, just to bring all 3 specs a little bit more closer in line. Though in PvP specifically, mages are receiving additional mobility nerfs and defensive nerfs that are going to hit all 3 specs pretty equally. From talents such as Overpowered Barrier, which will now cause barriers to last for 4 seconds instead of 5 seconds. Talents like Barrier Diffusion are now going to be made 50% as effective in PvP. A Cumulative Shielding talent is now going to be made 33% as effective in PvP, which is quite a pretty big loss. The talent of Temporal Velocity is now going to be 50% as effective within PvP content. And Incantation of Swiftness is now going to be reduced by 50% within PvP as well, which primarily affects Arcane Mages and their invisibility mechanic with Overpowered Barrier. On top of it, Arcane Mages are seeing even more reductions, with things like Chrono Shift now increasing movement speed by 10% instead of 25%. And Spellslinger's Slippery Slinging, which is actually going to affect both Arcane and Frost, that talent is being reduced by 50% within PvP. Arcane Mages also see an adjustment with the Arcane Surge within PvP, reducing its spell damage amp from 20% down to 15%, but increasing the direct damage of Arcane Surge by 40% instead. From there, we have the class of Monk, where Windwalkers are receiving some nerfs, but also buffs within PvE content. The entire kit of Windwalker within dungeons and raids is receiving a 4% nerf, though this nerf does not impact PvP content like arenas or battlegrounds. They also buffing the damage of Slicing Winds for PvE content, not impacting PvP either, increasing its effectiveness by 20% to make it better for Mythic Plus content. Though in PvP, monks do receive some additional changes. The Conduit of Celestial's Celestial Conduit healing is being reduced by 50% within PvP. Also, Last Emperor's Capacitor stacks are now reduced for PvP, also increasing the damage of your Chain Lightning by 30% or by 300% per stack, which is a nerf from 400 per stack, so a slight reduction there. Slicing Winds also further receives a 15% damage loss within PvP content specifically. For Mystery Monks, they're actually nerfing all of their damage by 25%, which does not impact PvP, just a dungeon and a PvE change. Though Jade Fire Teachings is going to grant you better transfer of damage, increased to 215% instead of 160. So if you are playing the Fistweaver playstyle, your overall throughput will be a little lower, but the damage to healing transfer will be higher to compensate for it. Though to make sure that Awakened Jadefire talents are still viable, Spinning Crane Kick, that is being buffed up by 15% to make sure that AoE damage transfer to healing, that still stays fairly relevant. Though while monks are getting nerfed in PvE content, in PvP they're actually receiving some buffs. Mana regeneration is being improved. Instead of reducing it by 50%, it is now only reduced by 40% with PvP, so a little bit extra resource gain there. Celestial Conduit healing is now also amped up by 50% within PvP because it has to do split healing to multiple allies. From there now, certain single target heals like Vivify buffed up by 25%, and Developing Mist healing also increased by 25%, and Renew and Mist increased by 40%, so quite a significant gain for Mistweaver for PvP content. Then we have the spec of Brewmaster, which is receiving a 3% buff on all ability damage, which isn't crazy, but it's a slight gain nonetheless. They're also buffing up your Foresight. Whenever you gain Luck of the Draw, your next 2 casts of Black Kick will now deal 250% additional damage and incur a shorter cooldown instead of 150% more damage, so quite a decent gain there as well. Then we have the class of Paladin, where Holy is receiving some healing buffs, like a 3% overall healing increase, which isn't crazy, but we don't stop there. Abilities like your Word of Glory or even Eternal Flame as the Herald of the Sun both are buffed up by 20%. Light of Dawn is also been further increased by 20% as well, so a little bit better value gain for all of your holy power spenders. Holy Prism AoE healing and damage is also being increased by 30%, as well as a single target or healing, and the ability can either single target heal a friend and then split damage to enemies, or single target hit an enemy and do AoE healing for allies. So all different aspects, no matter how you use the prism, do get amped up as well. And they also increase the damage of your Shield of the Righteous for PvE content, increasing it by 30%, which means a slight gain for Holy Paladins. As for Retribution Paladin, they increases the damage of your Final Verdict, increasing it by 20%, which is a bit of a gain when it comes to single target damage. From there though, we also have PvP specific Paladin changes, with the general change being Blinding Light no longer clears enemies of damage over time effects. So this is great for classes like Warlocks or maybe Rogues or any other class that plays around dot damage, because a Holy Paladin, not using Blinding Light carefully, can actually just remove all of the dots established by an Affliction Warlock, for instance, which needs those dots to deal damage, which could be a little bit asynergetic, so Blinding Light no longer removes dot effects from enemy targets. For Holy Paladins defensively, the buff in the effectiveness of Divine Protection, increasing its defensive value by 5 additional % within PvP. And for Red Paladin, they're doing something very similar, but they're also buffing their offensive value as well. They're increasing the effectiveness of Avenging Wrath to increase your damage and healing done by 15% rather than by 10%. The ability Blades of Justice is also going up by 20%, and Divine Protection will now decrease the damage you take by 15% instead, which is actually a slight gain, as this ability was heavily nerfed initially for PvP for quite some time now. From there we have the class of Priest, and they're actually buffing up Holy by quite a decent bit. Just about every ability in the Holy tree, as well as Holy abilities, is going up by a significant amount, with abilities like Prayer of Healing buffed up by 25%, Prayer of Mending buffed up by 20%, Renew buffed up by 60% baseline, and that can be further increased with a variety of talents. Talents such as Lightwell has also been buffed up by 30% on top of it. Divine Images also now do 20% more healing and damage as a bonus. Holy Fire is also buffed up by 20% as well, which can make it pretty good with Imperial Blaze as well as Burning Vehemence. With talents like Renewed Faith, you actually will now increase the healing done to allies with Renew by 10% instead of 6%. And Renews from Empower Renew will now heal for 120% more than a normal Renew, which was normally at 60%. Then there were a few buffs towards the Oracle playstyle to make that a little bit more appealing. With talents like Preemptive Care now increasing the duration of Renew by 40% instead of 25%, and Preventative Measures increasing the healing of Prayer Mending by 40% instead of 25%, and the damage of Smite, Holy Fire, and Holy Nova by 40% instead of 25%. But Holy Priest doesn't only make gains within dungeon and raid content, but it also makes gains within PvP as well, where it actually has slightly better mana regeneration, with mana regen reduced by 50%, which is much better than previous reduction of 65%. Also, all of your single target healing abilities from Flash Heal, Holy Word Serenity, Holy Word Sanctify, and Prayer of Mending, all of those are buffed up by 8% on top of all of this within PvP content specifically. From there, let's also make a quick detour with Shadow, and Shadow is just receiving a 3% damage nerf all across the board. That's about it. Not the biggest of nerfs, but just like a slight 3% reduction for the damage of the spec entirely. Nothing super huge, nothing super crazy. It's still going to be very strong and competitive. Another spec that's also very competitive and then trying to create some more room for other healers to grow is Disc Priest, which is especially still fairly dominant within both PvP and PvE content. So they're doing some reductions there, with talents like Lenience reducing your damage on allies with Atonement by 2% instead of 3%, which is a very slight gain, but it does stack up by quite a bit with some of the different DRs that the spec brings. They're also ever so slightly reducing Atonement healing, where previously your spell damage would heal all targets affected by Atonement for 35% of the damage done. This healing amped up by 100% outside of raids. That 35% is now reduced down to 32%, so it's a slight reduction on damage to healing transfer, which is not a biggest gain, but it may have a bit of a ripple effect to allow other healers to be a little bit more even with Disc Priest. Time will tell just how big this is going to be. For PvP, however, they are putting a heavier mana regen reduction on Disc. Instead of 30%, they're increasing it to 45%, and they're also reducing certain healing, like Evangelism healing is reduced by 25% within PvP content. And they're also reducing the healing taken bonus from the Undermine 4 set down to 20% of effectiveness instead of 50% effectiveness, so quite a hefty nerf all across the board. From there, we have the class of Rogue, where they're actually adjusting Assassination by a little bit. Like with some of the other classes, they're also going back to nerf their nerf bar 2-piece and 4-piece bonus. For these guys, it's specifically the 2-piece, which reduces the amount of Vile Tincture stacks they may have from 10 stacks down to 5, which further reduces some of their damage and its interaction with the 4 set. Though with that, they're also receiving other buffs like a 3% damage buff all across the board, as well as a 40% damage buff for both Mutilate and Ambush, which is a slight gain for single target, but does make certain talents that scale off of Mutilate and Ambush damage a little bit better. But both Mutilate and Ambush do not get buffed for PvP. This is just a dungeon and a raid change specifically. Though we do have one reduction for PvP content, and that is with the spec of Outlaw and the talent of Preemptive Maneuver. This is the only spec that's receiving a nerf for this PvP talent, where it will now decrease the damage taken by an additional 15% in stuns instead of additional 40%, and reduces the cost of Feint by 10% instead of 30% for Outlaw specifically. This was unusual because the other specs gain just as much benefit as Outlaw does, but I think this is primarily to curb the talent of Float Like a Butterfly, which gives you better cooldown reduction for evasion and feint. Even though this talent isn't played in the meta, I guess they decided that feint still has way too high of an uptime for Outlaw because of Float Like a Butterfly, so there's some additional nerfs, so Outlaw doesn't have as good of a defense as the other two specs, which is quite unfortunate. From there, we have the class of Shaman, and it looks like they're buffing Elemental, or at least attempted to bring him up a little bit. We have buffs towards abilities such as Lava Burst buffed up by 8%, Lightning Bolt buffed up by 8%, Ice Fury and Frost Shock also saw a 8% damage buff. Then we also have Primordial Wave, which is not as good as it used to be. It used to be great for Lava Burst cleave damage, but then they changed it to more instantaneous damage ability, and it just hasn't worked out super well. They're buffing the amount of Maelstrom gained from this ability, so it generates 12 Maelstrom instead of 3, and they're also buffing the actual damage by 500%, so maybe it'll be a little bit more significant. I guess time will tell. Definitely worth testing this as soon as the new changes come out. As for PvP, they are buffing Stormbringer Tempest ability for the Elemental, so the Tempest damage is now being increased by 20% within PvP to try to make those Elemental Lightning Shamans just a little bit better. As for the spec of enhancement, they're mostly seeing PvP adjustments with some buffs, but also some very surgical nerfs here and there. Abilities like Storm Strike as well as Wind Strike, which is part of the Ascendance, buffed up by 15%. Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning buffed by 10%. Ice Strike as well as the Ice Strike Slow buffed up. Ice Strike damage increased by 10%. The slow increased to 60% within PvP. Healing Surge Self-Healing also buffed up by 15%. However, the Primordial Storm ability, the secondary bonus from the Primordial Wave, that has been nerfed by 15%. Wind Fury damage, however, nerfed by 10%. And the Stormbringer Tempest damage also buffed up by 20%. So a slight reallocation of certain playstyles. Seems like a little bit further away from the Totemic as well, more towards to Stormbringer, or at least to make it a little bit more appealing within PvP content. Then we have the Restoration Shaman, and I actually missed this part of the patch notes, so I'm having to go back and re-record it. This is a long one, but Restoration tier set 2 set bonus is being adjusted. Apparently under my 2 set, there was an issue where using Totemic Projection to move a Surging Totem would automatically apply insurance to allies. Or it looks like it's actually part of the 4 set. Whenever you cast Surging Totem, 2 allies in the radius have insurance, and I guess when you move the totem, it also applied insurance to more allies. So you would have to drop the totem, then move it in the same spot that it's at to apply insurance guaranteed. I'm not a Resto Shaman, so I'm not exactly familiar with this bug, but apparently they fixed that interaction, but they end up buffing up the insurance healing by 30% to compensate, because you can't drop guaranteed insurance anymore using the Totemic Projection movement. From there, we also got class of Warlock with just a handful of changes. Demonology is receiving a 3% damage buff all across the board, which is nice. It doesn't really change anything too much in terms of Demonology, just makes your abilities a bit more impactful. Then we have the Spec of Affliction Warlock, where they're taking the Undermine 4 set bonus and are nerfing it ever so slightly, with the 4 set applying UA instead of to 3 targets down to only 2 targets within PvP content, so slightly less UA spread on that playstyle. And lastly, we have the class of Warrior, where Protection was looking like it was going to do as much damage as some of the damage dealers, and Blizz caught a whiff of it and said, nope, cannot happen, not in my video game. So we're seeing additional nerfs for Protection in terms of damage, but also as Colossus, which is super unfortunate because I was actually starting to have some fun with it as of recently. Abilities like Shield Slam are going to hit 5% less, which is not the worst gain. The majority of these changes are going to hit Colossus specifically. Like with the talent of Practice Strikes, the damage bonus for Shield Slam and Revenge is reduced to 10% rather than 20%. With the Colossus 1 against many talent, that is reduced down to 3% per target, was up to 5% per target. The talent Tide of Battle is also reduced to 7% per stack instead of 10% per stack of the Colossus Might above the damage of your Revenge, which overall results in a decent bit of a damage lowering for Colossus. Though Mountain Thane, they're trying to make that a little bit more appealing by buffing Strength of the Mountains, which is going to increase the damage bonus of Shield Slam to 15% up from 10%. So besides that, Arms Warrior does receive some significant changes for PvP specifically, like the damage of their Execute is being buffed up by 25% within PvP content. Blade Storm damage is being buffed up by 20%, which makes Slayer super good with that bolt damage combo. Though if you're someone who prefers to play Colossus over that, they also buff it up Demolish a little, buffing it by 15% for all the strikes from the shorter 2 strikes and then the big haymaker at the end. Everything about that ability is being amped by a decent bit, which should hopefully put Arms Warrior a bit more online and make it a little bit more burstier as either Colossus or Slayer. But with that, as always, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this patch notes update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very Very much appreciated. Join our Discord community, which is probably the best place to discuss all of the newest changes as soon as they appear, and we'll likely continue to see additional tuning and updates for the season's meta. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.